What would it look like if you were a more caring leader? Is that something you would strive for? And if so, are there any downsides to that goal? Do you want to be a more caring leader? If you are thinking about that, you're in the right place to understand all of those questions a whole lot better. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Development Sessions. A Remarkable Development Session is a webinar for a new world, a world where people want to learn the latest ideas and powerful techniques, but also want to learn together, a world of work that is different and more disconnected than ever. We know that we learn in interaction with others, but in this increasingly virtual world, the workshop experience has been shifted to focusing on delivering the content and leaving the application to you as an individual. Even if you love learning from webinars, you have likely thought there has to be a better way, a way to make a webinar far better than they are. And that's what we've created. You can go to kevineikenberry.com/remarkable development to learn more and register for an upcoming session on a valuable skill. And with that, I'm going to bring in our guests and introduce our guests to you. Before we dive in, I say guests because today I have two. If you're watching, you can see that. Our guests today are DeKoch and Phil Clampitt. Bob has devoted his entire career to leadership roles, refining his own skills and mentoring hundreds of aspiring leaders. He has over 4 decades of experience across major market sectors, the construction services industry and real estate development business, as well as the pulp and paper, beverage, and chemical industries. He's served on boards of U.S. corporations, both profit and not-for-profit, and he's currently the founder of the leadership consulting firm Limitless. Philip Clampitt is the Blair Endowed Chair of Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. He's won numerous awards for his teaching and scholarship. His students call him Dr. So What because he asked so what so often as a prod to encourage them to learn about the implication of their ideas. His work has been shared in the Wall Street Journal and MIT's Sloan Management Review. He's consulted on leadership, communication, and strategic planning with organizations such as Nokia, PepsiCo, the U.S. War College, and many more. Together, they have worked in partnership for over 30 years. Their third and newest book is Leading with Care in a Tough World, Beyond Servant Leadership, and that's where we're going to focus today. Guys, welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be here this morning. Happy to be with you.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to be with you. We're having this conversation, and Phil was talking about snow in Green Bay. By the time most other people hear it, snow in Green Bay will be a very normal thing. But when we're recording this, it's still a little on the unusual side. So one of you tell us how it is that you came to be working together all those years ago.
Well, let me start. Over 30 years ago, we got introduced to one another. I was looking for someone to help me do some consulting in leadership and communication. I met Phil. We started to do some work together in the company I was at, and we clicked. And we said to ourselves, let's do more than just some consulting. Let's start to write together, write some articles, started a book, and did a second book, as you said. And now this third capstone book is one that we're very excited about, Leading with Care in a Tough World. So that's my story.
Well, Bob asked me to come down and present to his group about the idea of how to audit communication practices. And I just received my PhD from the University of Kansas. And I was thinking I was on top of the world, and this is something I knew how to do. I'd worked with the best in the world, I thought. And Bob asked me a question. I remember asking it vividly. He said, "Phil, what does a world-class communication system look like?" I had no clue how to answer it, even though I'd been through all this training. And so I drove home thinking, well, that'll never go anywhere. But Bob was smart enough to pick up on the fact that even though I kind of stumbled through the answer, we were able to put some things together and do some really cool, great things over the last 30 years or so. So I'll be forever grateful that Bob saw through my stumbled answer at that point.
Well, and we'll talk about this a little bit today, I'm sure, but, as leaders, I mean, you were in a consulting role, but we don't need to have all the answers necessarily. So this book is called Leading with Care. So what do you mean by leading with care?
Well, the word care is something that's not often used in leadership circles. You hear participative management, you hear servant leadership, you hear all of the other types of leadership practices that are espoused and used. But the idea of caring, or as we said in the book, deep caring, is something you don't often hear with the leadership practice. What we mean by that is there's two things. One is we think the idea of caring about people is a much stronger emotional tie to people's psyche than things like servancy or engagement. And it fosters a real sense of involvement of people if the leader takes the time to care deeply about people. But it's not only caring about the people, it's caring about the outcomes that are needed for the organization, the outcomes that are needed to engage the people. And it's those two things together, the outcomes and the people, that need to be cared about, because the people are the ones that are going to deliver the outcomes, and they need to be deeply engaged to do that.
I could not possibly agree with you more. In our 3O model, we talk about outcomes and others and ourselves. And so we are 100% in sync about that. Finding that balance is the key, and we can't do it without our folks 100%. So, Bob, you mentioned this idea of deep caring, and it's one of the first things that struck me about the book is the idea of deep caring versus shallow caring. So, Phil, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what that means?
Well, this is something that really was a source of a lot of discussion between the two of us. And for us, the idea of deep caring is the idea that you take it to another level. It goes beyond just showing, I care about you in a visceral, in a simple way, but show empathy. You have to have empathy to be sure, but it's thoughtfulness, it's education, it's empowerment. So thoughtfulness about somebody's career, for example, is really important. Helping to educate them about how they can do better and get more involved, and then empowering them to show results. And so I think it's something beyond just the visceral kind of emotional thing in the moment. For example, I tell the story sometimes that we used to have a professor who would, like as teacher evaluations approach, she would always bring cookies to class, and that worked for the beginning of the semester, for the first semester, because that was showing that I care. But she never seemed to have time to talk about the career of the student. She never seemed to have time to answer their questions. And to me, that story of that particular individual is the example between shallow and deep caring, to show an example of that.
So I'm right with all this, but there was one piece, and you hit on it a little bit, but I'd love you to say a little bit more. When I look at the list, and there's a page in the book that shows a list of those two lists, shallow versus deep caring, as you've just described, Phil. But there's one word on the shallow side that I'd like you to say more about, because I think it's a critically important word, that action that a lot of people still aren't doing anyway. But on the shallow side, you have empathy. So talk to me about why empathy isn't as deep as perhaps you're encouraging us to get.
Yeah, so I can take that one. So when you have a conversation with someone and you're empathetic, you kind of have a sense that you're feeling their pain. You're trying to see that they understand that, I understand where you're coming from. Frankly, that's not enough, because just saying that I feel your pain, what the person would like to have, we think, the deeper sense, is that they want to have some ideas and some conversation about how I can get beyond the pain. What are your ideas that will help me through this problem, whatever the problem is? The phrase that we use in the book, and I often use in coaching, is, how can I help you today? That is not a phrase that says, how can I do your work for you? But how can I understand what your problems are? How can I try to take the barriers out of your way, help you get the barriers out of your way so you can move to a higher level? That's a sense of deeper caring versus just saying, I feel your pain.
So beyond understanding and acknowledgement and moving on to like what now what kind of thing.
Now what? What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? How can we figure out what you should do about it?
My favorite 2-word question. And long-term listeners will know I'll probably ask it before we're done. So let's talk. There are several big ideas in the book that on their own would be worthy of our conversation. But in each of these cases, the ones I've chosen, they also connect to this idea of caring as you're framing it. And I don't think that people would necessarily hook them together without hearing from you. So the first one of those is uncertainty. So let's talk about uncertainty in leadership. Everyone who's listening is going to say, yeah, we understand that one. We got that one, Phil and Bob. But the question is, how does uncertainty in our work and in our world connect to the idea of leading with care?
Well, we've done a lot of research about uncertainty. So what's fascinating to me is that even if an individual employee doesn't embrace uncertainty themselves, they want to work for organizations that do, because they know the world is changing. So that's one piece of it. The bigger piece of it, I think, is that when a leader says, I embrace uncertainty, that means they don't have all the answers, number one. Number two, it means the second person doesn't necessarily have all the answer, the other individual in the room, but collectively, which is the third point, we can have emergent answers by sharing what we know and what we don't know in order to move forward and to address the challenge or the problem. And in my view, you hear a lot about humility, I think in the whole discussion we had about empathy is the same thing. There is a short-term idea of empathy, there's a short-term idea of humility, but at a deeper level, a long-term kind of embracing uncertainty is say, I don't know all the answers, and you don't know all the answers, but collectively we can make a dent in the uncertainty and move the organization forward. And that requires a certain kind of mindset that a lot of leaders, people who move into leadership positions don't have. And I think it requires a special kind of leader to say, hey, I don't have all the answers, but we're going to move forward and make things happen.
Phil, I got promoted because I was good at my other job. Like I knew the answers in the other job. So I thought that's what I was supposed to do now, is have the answers. You're telling me, I'm being facetious, but that's obviously often what happens, right? Is that's why that is in the way, is because people got there because they had answers, and now they kind of think they're supposed to, right?
And we make selections, Kevin, we make selections of people for leadership positions based on the fact that they, quote, had the answers in a specialty area.
Yep.
And that's important. But in the role of a true leader, the role of the leader isn't to have the answers. The role of the leader is to bring together smart people with diverse points of view that can come to a better answer than you have yourself. That doesn't mean that you as a leader won't have an opinion, but if you lead with that opinion and cause the conversation to move in a direction that is your favorite answer, you have dismissed all of the other stuff that can happen with the other minds in the room, and you get suboptimal results. And that's at the core of this idea of embracing uncertainty, because for the leader, it's a very uncertain time when they have to go look around the room and say, there's 12 other ideas that we have to meld together. That's a very uncertain thing versus the leader saying, oh, we're going to jump to this one or that one. And that's the essence of embracing uncertainty.
Right. And then, of course, there's the press of the urgent, right? We don't have time to do all that work, Bob. That takes a lot of time. So Phil, you said something a second ago about the fact that it takes a certain mindset to deal with and lead with uncertainty. And Bob, you said, well, maybe in some cases we aren't necessarily selecting on the right criteria, which I would agree with. So what's the solution? Like, what's the mindset that we need, and how do we help to cultivate that with the leaders we've already got that might not yet have that mindset?
Well, in my view, that the shift has to occur from me having all the answers as a leader to me to, as a leader, I know how we're going to reach the answer and navigate through this situation. So it's a movement away from what I call the who questions of who's got the right answer to the what questions and the how questions of how we're going to get the answer. So what I think happens as a leader, and Bob and I have talked about this quite a lot, is you get promoted to position oftentimes because of a level of expertise that you might have in a particular area. But once you get outside that area of expertise, it becomes more and more an issue of how do you bring expertise from multiple viewpoints together to forge an answer to move forward. And as you move up in the organization, this becomes extremely important. So at that point, it really is less about who has the right answer rather than how we're going to meld all these different opinions and different ideas in order to come up with a better solution to resolve the issue or to seize the challenge that might be in front of us.
So the word process pops to the top of mind now, like, and you've said it, the how. And so one of the other things I thought we would explore a little bit is the how, which is how does collaboration connect with caring? I mean, you've led us up to that. So let's talk about caring and collaboration.
So caring and collaboration is right at the intersection of getting ideas from a group of people who can contribute to the overall result. So the leader's role in that situation, whether you're talking about a group of 2 or a group of 10 or a group of 100, the leader's role is to make an environment that's safe for people to share what's on their mind about a particular issue, to bring out the innovation and the best in people. Now, not everybody will have the same bravery in that kind of a conversation. And so the leader's job is not to home in on the 3 people who are talking, but to home in on the 5 people that aren't talking and draw out their thoughts and to make sure they know it's safe to put their thoughts on the table and they're not going to be no reprisal for what they say, and then begin to mold together the thoughts and the connections between the various ideas. That's the leader's role, to orchestrate the conversation in that way. And it takes a particular skill. It takes patience. Kevin, as you said before, you're going to take some time to do that. But the time you take to get the buy-in of the total group in that environment is far less than the time you'll take later picking up the pieces for the people who didn't speak when they wanted to speak, and they talk in the hallway and undermine what the group came up with. That's true collaboration. We often talk about something that we call full collaboration, which is the image of collaborating in a group, but it's not collaborating at all, where it focuses on just 1 or 2 opinions, and everybody feels like they're not being heard, and they leave and say, well, that was a predetermined conclusion. And that's the kind of thing that has to be stifled.
Just because we're in a meeting together, virtually or in person, doesn't mean we're collaborating, is what I'm hearing you say.
Exactly right.
Doesn't necessarily mean that we are, right?
Right.
So there are 3 ideas that I wanted to bring together. One is uncertainty, then collaboration connects to that. And the third one that you spend some time in the book talking about is learning, which is certainly one of my key points as I think about us as leaders. But, and really you've said some things already that connect to the idea of we've got to be learning, right? Curiosity, working through, asking other people's opinions and all that. But how does learning specifically connect to our role as a more caring leader?
Well, I think learning is at the center of caring because it links back, as you just said, links back to the whole idea of uncertainty. If you're not always learning, you're not growing. And if you're not growing, you're not going to be addressing the issues that are out there. So I think great leaders are always learning. They're curious out there for things they might be missing, perspectives they need to incorporate that they never had before. And that learning means that you have to do it in a lot of different modes as well. So it's not just, some people learn in one mode and they're really, really good at it. But then if you shift mode a little bit, that will help you learn in a way that's different. So I think it's central to caring is that you're always learning A, about people, and B, about the tasks and perspectives that need to be out there.
And I would probably add and say that learning in the leadership arena is not something that's natural to many leaders. It's not something that's natural in the development process because people, as we said before, are taken from, quote, a technical success and put into a leadership position without basic training in leading and managing. And that's a problem because the skills of leadership are different than the skills involved in a technical solution. And people themselves have to be committed to a lifelong effort to learn more about leadership, not only through the job they're in, but through other, whether it's seminars, courses, reading, other experiences that they would expose themselves to, travel, whatever the cultural experiences are that will get them to get a more open mind. Those are all important in leadership learning.
We are talking with the authors of the new book, Leading with Care in a Tough World. And, one of the things I love about the book, and I'm going to tie that to learning real quick, is that throughout the book, you have a number of models, simple models that give us as learners, especially the visual learners, a way to encapsulate some of what you're talking about, which I think is a really great addition to the book, and it really sets the book apart. So I've got a couple more things I want us to talk about before we start to wrap up. And I'm looking at the clock, and the three of us talked about time before we started, but there's a couple things I really do want to talk about. One is you talk about pushback, and a lot of leaders are afraid of what to do with pushback or resistance, but you suggest some things that we should do. How do we turning pushback into progress? So can you give us a couple of tangible things, perhaps?
Yes. Yeah, I actually think that was one of the most fun parts of the book to write, and it's one of the most interesting concepts. A lot of people have learned through servant leadership, like the idea of, well, we need to ask questions, but they don't know what to do with it after that. And so that's what your question is. And so some people think, well, that's a time to argue, but we're making the point that, and I'm a former debater, so I'm okay with that, but you've got to have the right context for it. And where I've seen everything go awry is when they don't clarify what the expectations of the pushback conversation are going to be. What's the likely outcome? And we were talking before about learning and uncertainty management. I actually can see a visible sigh of relief when a leader says, and I've seen Bob do it, I've seen other leaders do it occasionally, when they say, I never thought of it that way before. And that is the whole idea of embracing uncertainty and learning through the process. And through progress and through pushback, you have to say, look, I don't want to say I have a firm opinion on this, but this is my opinion. Let's talk about it. And you have to say, these are the likely outcomes that are going to happen. The second thing I would do, that's really important to me, is let's isolate the areas of agreement. I try to write them down on a whiteboard, and areas of disagreement, and where we have differences of perspective. Putting it on the board, on a whiteboard, for example, or on a flipboard, or writing it down, has a way of depersonalizing and de-emotionalizing the conversation around, this is your idea, this is my idea, and I'm going to win this contest, and more like, let's focus on what's the best idea is that will resolve that. And so to me, those are just two specific things. There are others, of course, but those are two big ones that I have found that have a magical impact on having a productive pushback conversation.
I might add that the leader's reaction to pushback, even the initial reaction to that idea that comes out of somebody else's mouth, sets the tone for the dialogue that follows. So pushback, which is generally is a difference of opinion, if that's viewed as a disagreement or as an attack on the leader's point of view, and even the small words that come out of their mouth to suggest I'm going to argue with you, sets a path that is non-productive. You have to set a path that encourages more. You said the word listening before, active listening in that situation so that you'll understand what the pushback is about. And then you might say to yourself, as Phil said, I never thought of it that way. But if you don't set the tone properly when the pushback starts, you're heading down a path that's not going to result in progress.
And I would submit it's even in many cases before you say anything. What happens in your face, especially if we're on at a distance like we are today, what shows in our face? Do our eyes roll? Do we tense up? All that stuff before we even everything you said, Bob, and sometimes before we even say anything,
Absolutely,
sets that tone.
Absolutely.
So I just mentioned being on the screen. You know, one of the things that's happened, obviously, for many of us over the last approaching 3 years, is a pandemic came to us, and it changed the way many of us needed to work, had to work, at least for a while, and therefore how we had to lead. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, well, I would say this. I would say that early in the pandemic, many leaders started to do some things that the three of us would probably call leading with care, at least shallow caring, if not more. The question is, what has the pandemic done to change all of this conversation? Did we learn stuff that we've kept doing? Have we fallen back? Like, what is your take on all of that? Like where we are now having this conversation versus where we were in March of 2020 or February of 2020 having this conversation?
Well, there's several things that have happened globally, I think. Number one, I think the leaders I talk to is it, in some ways, it shifted power to employees rather than people in the leadership positions often at the organization, which creates its own dynamic. The second thing I would argue that happens is that the whole idea of the pandemic that has been challenging is the whole management of the remote work environment. So how do you manage that? And now as we're coming out of the pandemic, I have a discussion I know later this week occurring where I'm going to be dealing with how do we deal with a workforce that said, hey, I did my work just as well at home as I'm doing at the office. Why can't I work from home for that? And so I think the reverberations of that will be felt for quite some time. And companies are going to have to work that out. It'll depend upon the industry, et cetera. The third thing that we've kind of touched on this before, but it's an absolutely fascinating area. And that is the third thing that I've discovered with the pandemic is it has forced organizational leaders to really say, what do we need to collaborate on and what do we not need to collaborate on for the sake of time? And if we are going to collaborate on these things, because collaboration takes a lot of time, how are we going to maximize that time and use it in a way that's productive to allow us to accomplish the objectives that we need to accomplish? So I have a feeling that we're going to hear a lot more about the power of collaboration, but when to use collaboration and when not to use it for various things. And I think those are three particular impacts that are happening as a result of COVID. And the fourth one, if you want to add a fourth one, is this whole idea of uncertainty. How does a leader manage and not provide false certainty when things are highly volatile like they are with the COVID? And I think the trust will emerge from how those leaders learn to manage the uncertainty. And some managed it well and some did not.
Yeah, the trust will either merge or it will further dissolve, one or the other, right? For sure. I appreciate those thoughts. So I want to shift gears before we finish and ask both of you, and I have Bob, I have you go first. Like, what do you do for fun, Bob?
Okay. Well, I travel. My wife and I travel. We're also boaters. We have a boat on Lake Michigan that we use as a summer home and as a way of traveling around the water. We both love it, and we've been doing it for many years. And the only problem with boating in Wisconsin, which is where we live, is that this time of year the boat doesn't work so well because it's starting to snow.
It's time to put it away. And now what you need to do is come across the lake to Ludington, and then you'll be really close to where I grew up and where my farm is.
Okay.
So
You know all of this.
So, Phil, what do you do for fun?
Well, I love to hike in the woods, and I love to bike. I cycle a lot during the summer, try to do some centuries every now and then. And then in the winter, I'll still hike if I can, but I also love backcountry skiing, cross-country skiing. And so anything to be outdoors, I'm going to be outdoors.
All right. Awesome. So the only question that you knew I would ask is the next one. And Phil, I'll have you go first. So what are you reading, or what's something that you've read recently that you might want to share with us?
Well, I read a lot, and the book I'm reading right now is Nimitz at War, and it's crazy because I was reading it last night, and it's like this guy seems like a caring leader from the get-go. And I wasn't really familiar with what he did, the Pacific part of the World War II. And the second book, I'm very interested in World War II, is called Resistance. And it's incredibly wonderful book. It's about how people resisted Nazis, Germany, in the occupied countries and all the various forms of resistance. So you can see it links up with my passion to talk about pushback and uncertainty, because when you read about that, you realize how different people deal with it.
All right, Bob, same question.
Okay, so there's a gentleman by the name of Robert McKee. We talk about him in the book. He's an internationally known screenwriter and teacher of storytelling for screenwriters. And I befriended him a number of years ago. We talk about him in the book. And he's written a number of books. One of them is called Story. And he took a guy who, and this is one of my learning and coaching experiences with him, not only reading his books, but he took a guy that was proud of his PowerPoint presentations of all of the data and rhetoric about business and turned him into an executive who had some idea about how to tell the same story in stories. And that has been a tremendously valuable experience for me. And
I love that. And that is a fabulous, fabulous book. So now the question that you've both wanted me to ask, like, Kevin, please, where can we learn more about what you guys are doing? Where do you want to point us? Where can we get the book? Where do you want to tell us about all that?
So the book's available on all of the modern social or modern platforms for buying books, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all of those. But we have a website. It's www.leadingwithcare.net. The homepage has buttons to push for ordering the book. And the website is quite rich. It's got information about us, information about our work, summaries of the book. In the resource tab, it's got information about training materials and videos that we've recorded explaining the book. So leadingwithcare.net is a great resource for ordering and for learning more about it.
And that will point you to all other places for the two of you, including drsowhat.com, which has got to be one of my new favorite URLs on the planet. I need to go see if I can get Dr. Now What, because that's the question I want to ask next. It's the question that I ask every single week here. And people who know me might get tired of me asking this question, but the question for all of you who are listening or watching is, now what? Okay, so what are you going to do with this? What action are you going to take as a result? You've got some ideas. Now what? And I can't list for you what your key ideas were. I have a list of my own. It could be as simple as, hey, I'm going to get a copy of the book and read it. That would be great. And I know that Bob and Phil would love that. But beyond that, like what action do you want to take around getting clarity around what collaboration looks like for you and your team moving forward? What do you need to do differently to create a greater sense of humility, perhaps, for yourself as a leader? We could go on, mining the ideas that we heard in the last 35 minutes. But that's the ultimate question. If you don't take action as a result of this, sort of what was the point? Guys, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure, such a pleasure to have you, and glad to have a little bit of your time today.
Thank you, Kevin. Pleasure for us as well.
And so with that, everybody, if you enjoyed this episode, there are 300 and some others. So you might want to scoot back and look for some more. I'll link in the show notes to some other past episodes that I think are great connections to this one. And if you've been listening for a long time, have you told a friend? I hope you'll do that. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.